Hello again to another Agakala React, and today we're watching the politics of fantasy maps from Worlds Unreal. And let's just jump into it and see what it is, because obviously gonna be some Unreal maps and stuff, but oops.
Of different visual arts, maps are seldom considered. Maps today are thought of as blueprints or manuals. Their job is to show...
Let's try again.
Under the myriad of different visual arts, maps are seldom considered. Maps today are thought of as blueprints or manuals. Their job is to show information as plainly and accurately as possible. We have different maps for different purposes, most of them scientific, but it doesn't take long to find some very weird niche maps. It's tempting to see these maps as not real, but joke maps still fulfill a purpose, and they can still be both accurate and very weird at the same time. Even maps that seem objective often aren't. After all, why is this map the right way up, but this one is upside down? Many conventions of map making are just that, conventions. They aren't a reflection of measurable things, they're just tradition. The fact that I see North America in my mind as this, and not this, is part of it. We've all probably looked at a lot of globes.
I've never seen it like that.
And the projection styles we see have likely influenced our view of the world. Is North America in the center of the map, or at the edge? Is Greenland the biggest continent, or is it just a little guy? Are the fun, bumpy mountains on this globe to actual scale? What's the smallest landmass that's visible? Does it show climate, or elevation, or forest? What's the smallest settlement size? How are the metropolitan areas measured? What counts as the capital? Does underwater elevation have to be included? Should every country be divided into states and provinces, or just the United States? Who gets to claim this little bit? Is Taiwan part of China? Clearly, there is too much information here for our poor little brains. In order to make any readable map, we need to show some things and leave other things out. We need priorities. In other words, maps require agendas.
So you're not talking about fantasy worlds maps? That's what I'm thinking gonna be.
For this video essay, I'm going to borrow a particular usage of the word land, and it goes something like this.
For us, land, the more general term, refers to landscapes as a fixed geographical and physical space that includes Earth.
And so, I want to examine the implicit assumptions many of us have about making maps of fictional places.
Ah, there are. Okay.
By nature.
Okay.
For this video essay, I'm going to borrow a particular usage of the word...
I thought for a moment that it's basically gonna be about maps that they're fantasy, as in kinda like weird maps, but our own world, not the fantasy worlds. But yeah, so let's just go.
And it goes something like this.
For us, land, the more general term, refers to landscapes as a fixed geographical and physical space that includes earth, rocks, and waterways, whereas land, the proper name, extends beyond a material fixed space. Land is a spiritually infused place grounded in interconnected and interdependent relationships, cultural positioning, and is highly contextualized.
From this standpoint, we can start to think of maps as reflective of people's specific, subjective understanding of the world, and from there, we can come to understand fictional places as not so different from real places. Although cartography is a combination of science and aesthetics, the aesthetic part has been growing less and less important since the Enlightenment period. Looking at older maps, we get to see things that are kind of right, as well as things that look very wrong to us. This 1572 engraving of Cusco is a depiction of a real place that once existed, but it doesn't match up with archaeological evidence. It is far too regular and square in appearance, and also too small. The image was drawn based on descriptions of the city by an artist who had never been there himself, yet this was the only image of the ancient Inca capital available to Europeans at the time. Here we can see how fiction and fact fuse together in some mapmaking. This is the plan for Azilia, a utopian city model from 1717. It was proposed as a new colony in Georgia, but it was never built. Its symmetry and mathematical nature is typical of the other utopic maps of the time. This Portuguese impression of Goa has multiple perspectives, and would be considered upside down today. This 1595 map of Europe features the mythical island of Brassel, off the coast of Ireland. Other maps dating back to the 14th century have depicted this phantom island, which is described by Irish mythology as being cloaked in mist and only visible once every 7 years. The Carte de Tendre is a 17th century French map depicting an imaginary island inspired by the stages of love. It is a fascinating example of sentimental cartography, which seeks to map out matters of the heart. As we go further back in time, the divide between fictional and factual map, scientific and artistic, becomes more obscure. The existence of fictional alternative worlds was something non-existent, or at least rare for most of history. Small fantasy maps appeared mostly in children's books, just as fantasy was relegated to a children's genre. Tolkien popularized the alternative world map, which has now become ubiquitous in many fantasy novels, movies,
True.
and shows. And although Tolkien was a staunch medievalist, his map, which was drawn by his son, still has a very modern appearance in some respects. For example, it is a standard rectangular shape, and not circular.
Tolkien leaned heavily on this tradition that saw mapping as a prerequisite of world building and storytelling. He took the practice of having a prefatory cartographical structure for his plot and turned it into a medievalism with these maps that feel medieval, even if they don't visually hold up.
The point being, despite the fact that Tolkien was an expert on medieval subjects, he still made a map that reflected the culture of his time. Clearly, some fictional maps have different functions, but most fictional maps are essentially resting on our respect for the accuracy of maps to make them legitimate tools for fiction and world building. To modernize, a truly medieval map is not useful enough. The map of Westeros in A Game of Thrones, the book that is, sticks with this hybrid almost exactly. The TV show's map and fan-made maps begin to deviate from this slightly.
Even the Game of Thrones TV series, usually rife with medievalisms, leads in with that thoroughly unmedieval dynamic maps of cogs and gears. But it's the introductory placement that matters, in this case reminding the viewer of the specific relevant locations, changing each time for the upcoming episode's events. It reminds the viewer of place and cues them to remember where, or rather how, that piece of the chronicle left off.
The content of maps reflects what is important in their narrative, or in some cases, what is important to the author. Some maps exist to help orient the audience, and others serve a greater purpose in the story itself. Beyond looking medieval or making places feel more concrete, a map is a catalog of important ideas. If you are a world builder, you want to be maximally aware of how your culture influences the ways in which you create and envision other realities. You may then choose to embrace these influences or reject them, but it never hurts to be aware of them. And so, I want to examine the implicit assumptions many of us have about making maps of fictional places. Since the 19th century, we have lived with the legacy of nation-states. What this means is that we tend to live in countries that think of themselves in largely mono-ethnic terms. The ethnicity is the country, is the ethnicity. Germany is German. Russia is Russian. Algeria is Algerian, so on and so forth. All of those nations have ethnic minorities that have lived there for hundreds of years, but they aren't thought of as integral to the state, its values, and its culture, and they usually don't have an equal seat at the table. Since the French Revolution and the creation of nations like Germany and Italy, many of us have inherited a particular view of human society. A Berlin schoolteacher once said,
A state is nothing without a folk, a soulless artifact. A folk is nothing without a state, a bodiless phantom, like the wandering gypsies and Jews. Only the unity of a state and a folk makes a Reich.
This may seem like disturbing or alien rhetoric, but it is the same argument that creates all nation-states. And many of us still look at maps using this essential logic. Bodiless phantoms are conspicuously missing from political maps. We might think of ourselves as worldly and multicultural, but I'd venture the average pre-modern empire was more multicultural in nature. For example, the Mongolian Empire was religiously tolerant, diverse, and eventually it wasn't even really Mongolian. It was a Turkic, Persian, Arab, Afghan, Chinese, Mongol thing. But on a map, it might get reduced to just Mongols. It's also very normal for maps from our own history to name places and the people within them after dynasties: Safavids, Capetians, Habsburgs, Tang. This is a way of referring to groups of people that would seem utterly bizarre today. Can you imagine if the people of the late 1970s UK were called Thatcherites? The point is, there are lots of different ways of making a political map, and the tendency is for the conventions to change over time to reflect how people think of political entities. Dynasties aren't an important way of thinking about states anymore, but in the pre-modern world, they were practically the only way. We tend to obscure the makeup of our own real-world spaces when we focus on borders and states instead of people. We live in a world defined by political maps, and political maps are probably the most subjective, narrow, and obfuscating of all maps. Fantasy maps usually have state boundaries of some kind, and if they do mention ethnicities, it's usually only in the context of a state, or because there is a complete absence of one. Maps that show states are a valid, useful kind of map, but they aren't necessarily more important than maps that display language, culture, ethnicity, or species. When world builders focus too much on nation-states, they forget that the world doesn't abide by these simplistic concepts. They unknowingly flatten the diversity and breadth of their world, but most importantly, it forgets about people who don't organize into states with borders. If you're building a pre-modern world, you should avoid this pitfall. We live in a world where borders are heavily enforced. We have rules saying who can be a part of what nation-state, rules for temporary work, rules for becoming naturalized, and borders with permanent infrastructure. Most of human history hasn't had this. For many people, the realities of migration are obscured, but migration is normal and has been ubiquitous throughout human history. And yet, so many fictional worlds seem static, with easily defined boundaries and monolithic populations, which are content to live in the same area for thousands of years. Borders obscure how mobile and unbound our world actually is. The unfamiliarity of borderless territories is often reflected in the mysterious and dangerous ways they are represented. Look, for instance, to the Romans on campaign in the dark woods of Germania, British explorers in the Arctic wastes, or cowboys on the frontier, as an author wrote of modern borderlands.
A borderland is a vague and undetermined place, created by the emotional residue of an unnatural boundary. It is in a constant state of transition. The prohibited and forbidden are its inhabitants.
But I get it. It's hard to map things without solid lines. If a map is a catalog of important things, not everything can be important. However, it's worth considering what we find important on a map. The truth is that most fantasy maps reflect colonial, imperialistic values and ideas. That's not necessarily wrong, per se. My own most developed fantasy world, the Centrum, is completely characterized by its colonialist appearances and theme. But it's a world that mirrors our own pre-World War II history, which was defined by imperial powers that spanned the globe, and the world I made, quite purposefully, is dominated by nation-states much like Earth's modern ones. The problem is when all world-building takes this form by virtue of this historical legacy. The problem is when all world-building is defined by nation-states, borders, and the differences between so-called civilized people and those who are one with nature. The problem is when the exterior of empire has no dispossessed people within it, and empires are built on dispossession. When someone looks at your fantasy map and sees an area with nothing listed in it, will they think, nobody lives here? That was certainly the assumption of many European maps that implied the Americas were empty. Has the fantasy map created a tabula rasa for its readers to insert their assumptions? Has the world builder inadvertently replicated the most problematic themes of the modern day? When we become more aware of our surroundings, we are less likely to mindlessly parrot old ideas. World building is personal, and there are no set-in-stone rules. But if the map helps build the narrative, an original map makes for an original narrative. Fantasy largely began as the retelling of European mythology, and a kind of escapism from a world of industry, modernized warfare, and dying religion. Fantasy will always have a component of escapism, and it's allowed to. Not everything has to address current societal issues or mimic the darkest facets of the real world. Books like A Wizard of Earthsea and Game of Thrones have pushed fantasy in a new, postmodern direction. Ursula K. Le Guin, the author of A Wizard of Earthsea, wrote on the assumption of good and evil in fantasy.
There are lots of fantasies about the battle between good and evil, the BBGE, sure. In them, you can tell the good guys from the evil guys by their white hats or their white teeth, but not by what they do. They all behave exactly alike, with mindless and incessant violence, until the problem of evil is solved in a final orgy of savagery and a win for the good team.
Fantasy maps are capable of demonstrating ideas of good and evil. Names are meant to evoke a feeling, connections to real places. The Shire sounds pleasant, Mordor does not. The stereotypical fantasy map plainly provides a reader with an evil place and a good place. I think many maps have moved away from this. What remains is more subtle, but still just as important, the divide between the natural and civilized world. In the framework of the modern, as opposed to the postmodern, civilization is good. Civilization is the conquest of nature, and all who appear to be indistinguishable from it. The city is safe and good, and beyond the city are monsters and darkness that must be tamed. But hey, it's a useful trope, you say. Certainly, but it can be reversed to great effect. Dystopian settings sometimes reverse these ideas. In the Hunger Games, the capital is the most dangerous and alien place for the main characters. Sometimes the wilderness is the safest place, far from the eyes of tyrannical governments. Historically, this has been true for many people. Civilizations are not kind places to the dispossessed, the supposed bodiless phantoms of the world. And with a closer look, one can see that fantasy has had a kind of respect for nature right from the beginning. It need not be doomed to repeat the themes of colonial empire. Sometimes civilization is what's wrong with the world, but sometimes this romanticism is misplaced, merely echoing the story of the noble savage. It's hard to separate these concepts at times. Moving forward with fantasy maps, we as world builders must keep in mind that the divide between civilization and nature is a manufactured one. All people live in nature, and all people live apart from it as well. The empty portions of the map are only empty from the perspective of certain people in the world, but we should make sure that person is never us, the world builder. Every map was made by someone with an agenda. When we make maps, let's think about who that person is, what they know about the world, and why this map is useful for them. This place that they named, did it already have a name given by someone else? Do they believe that by renaming it, that it belongs to them? If our map is purely for ourselves, let us be honest with it. Let's map with just as much thought to people as to states and empires. In our map, there are no bodiless phantoms, just different cultures. Some of them are powerful, and some of them are not. But neither of them is unimportant in this world of our creation.
Oh, that was that went faster than I was thinking it would. And I love maps in fantasy books. I find that if there is I find that a lot of fantasy books have a lot of places that you're gonna go to. So when there is a map on the beginning of the book, it kind of helps me to put the places in relation to what I'm reading right now. Science fiction, obviously, it's not as... It wouldn't have them. I don't think I ever read a science fiction book that would have a map, because most of the time science fiction books that I read are happening in the space. So that wouldn't be something given. But yeah, maps are interesting things. I always liked as a kid even look through the atlases and looking at different places, the names where they are, roads and stuff like that. I'm older, so you know, maps were something that you were using back in my childhood to actually travel. There was no GPS, so maps were kind of like on a daily basis, and atlases and road maps especially. So I always liked it, and finding new places and kind of thinking about what they are and things like that was kind of cool too when I was a kid. So yeah, what do you think? Do you like maps? Do you like fantasy books? And do you like when there are maps in there? Because I do. Anyway, thank you very much for watching, and I see you tomorrow. Bye!